Christmas won't be Christmas without any presents. So begins Little Women, likely the most beloved and certainly one of the most influential books of American literature. Hey, this is Barry King of TF-XCite with a little bit of a kind of a holiday cheer article, kind of a knockoff of one I put up about, 4 or so years ago on a Connecticut athletic site that is pretty much dormant now. So we're doing the video version of it for TF-XCite, and it's related to, again, Little Women, one of the just the all-time greats of American literature, and a book that also was a big influence for girls in the last century and a half to get out and run. So we're going to talk about that. Back in the early 70s, when I entered the high school athletic scene, I had always kind of assumed that girls had been, doing athletics, had been running for a long time. Actually, it had been very, very recent, basically pretty much with the beginnings of 1970 or so. It was when they first started coming in. So no, it was a very new phenomenon. And in my high school up in Wallingford, Connecticut, Lyman Hall, they had almost an equal amount of girls teams as boys teams when I graduated. And maybe the boys had a little bit more, not much more though. And the girls also had other athletic activities, and cheerleading. Well, it's a sport now, but certainly was very rigorous and active at my school, and the majorettes and the pep clubs, things like that. So the girls had a lot of physical activities to be involved in. But that hadn't always been the case. There was a time when that certainly was not true. Back in the early 1900s, girls started getting into sports. They had not been that active before that in America, but then again, sports in America had been, wasn't that old a phenomenon. There had been old-time show people who went around and did athletic activities such as walking and long walk types of activities. But the running and the sports for girls had been not particularly big, except maybe a little bit in basketball. Certainly in the 19-teens and 1920s, girls were. You could see the scores in the city papers here in around New York City area, and in New York, the girls actually had their first state championship in basketball before the boys did. So, but that all ended basically with the Depression, and it was a long time for girls getting back into sports in an organized way. There were always things like AAU and competitions and all, but certainly not at the high school level much. So it wasn't until around the 1970 or so, and this was before the coming of Title IX, of course, that girls' sports started to really get going. It got going a bit in the 60s, and then beginning of the 70s, things really burst out, and not necessarily state championships for the girls right away, but things got going for them, and so girls got recognized in championships in running, cross country, and on the track. But if we wanted to go back, a few thousand years, we could go back to a time when women were actually having opportunities to some extent to participate in the athletics, and this is Way back in the Greek times, the Olympic game times, yeah, the women had their championships back then at the Olympic Games. They had the Hurrayan Games where girls were given trophies, and I guess you could say for in certain types of running competitions. Of course, they weren't allowed to even watch the male versions of the Olympics, although they could win the famed laurel wreath if they were the sponsors of a chariot, the winning chariot team, because the wreath went to the sponsor of it, the owner of it, and all. But yeah, girls got to they had some activities back then, and goes into the Greek legends. Atalanta was that doesn't come out of nowhere. That we have the story of the girl who could beat everybody, was much faster than anybody until she started picking up those golden apples. And I'll have to say, a gold apple like that would weigh a huge amount. So the fact that she could run with the 3 apples at the end at all, and hey, for the guy who was throwing them too, of course, that would have been quite a feat of strength there. But yeah, the back in Greek times and later, when the Romans occupied Greece and everything, and the games continued on for a while, and you have these uniforms that are kind of interesting, not too much different than what they're wearing today, but for the most part in the Greek times they would have been wearing more of a skirt, and everything. They have a certain name for that, but in any case, it goes back to the times of the Greeks that there was some running, but by in the following centuries, certainly in Europe and everything, although girls, I'm sure, were heavily involved in sports, they just didn't, you don't get the pictures of it, you don't get records of it, but, sporting activities, knocking a ball around, I'm sure they did that with their brothers up to a certain point before, you had to get into the roles of adulthood and everything. Okay, so fast forward through from Greek times through the Middle Ages and all, and let's go to the mid-1800s. Sure, girls were running around on the farms, when they were young, certainly just about anywhere probably, but once you got to adulthood, things would have changed. For most women, but there was somebody up in mainly the Massachusetts, New Hampshire area named Louisa May Alcott, who had had a little bit of a different upbringing than probably just about anybody at the time. She was the daughter, one of 4 daughters, of a kind of a progressive thinking father who was he was an educator and took care of his daughter's education to a great extent, and he and the family, including Louisa, later on would be involved in abolitionist movement, equal rights for women, and they were vegetarians, and they ran in a circle with some famous people, like famous writers, Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson, who Louisa actually got schooled a little bit with. She listened to them, and they taught her things. Because again, it was they were in the same orbit, and she picked up some obviously some not just philosophy, but a lot to do with writing too. And she was as she grew up, she was helping, all around the family and in the community. And she was a governess, teacher, and with various occupation. And then the Civil War breaks out in 1861 and all, and she spends some time at home. I guess they were up and around Concord, I guess at that point, Concord, Massachusetts, or maybe up in New Hampshire. The family kind of moved around a bit. And so she volunteered to be a nurse, and had a long and arduous trip down to the Washington, D.C. area, and to work in a hospital there. And it was a pretty horrific experience. It was a very grungy hospital, the Union Hospital that she was at, and guys came in with a lot of them dying, and having all sorts of disfigurements from the bullets, cannonballs, and everything, and everything. So she was tending to them, reading to them in certain cases, but also just, doing all the nursing work for a while. And she ended up getting typhus there because the Civil War, many of the soldiers, many of the casualties from the Civil War were from the diseases, not necessarily even getting wounded, but just from the disease that hit you. And typhus was one of the big ones, and they treated her anyway, with a mercury compound medicine that probably it did lasting damage to her, and it looked like she might die. So anyways, they got her out of there and packed her off home, where she spent a couple months recovering before she could get back to work. And that work, when she was kind of almost like an invalid for a while, she wrote up her memoirs, in a sense, the details of her service in the hospital for those 6 weeks that she was tending there, and got that published, and it became a format for a whole bunch of other books from people in the medical field, doctors, nurses, and it was very inspirational to them, talking about, it was not only a description of basically how horrible it was in the hospitals, but also, about things that could be done better. So, from that, Louisa May Alcott got offerings to do more writing, and what she did, she wrote for a number of journals at the time, I think the Atlantic Monthly even, and she got a job editing for a children's magazine, which she didn't particularly love doing. The kind of children's literature that was put out at that time in the the mid 1860s there was very sentimental, kind of preachy type of stuff that she didn't particularly love, and maybe a country coming off of the Civil War, it was even more into that than they had been in the earlier period. But in any case, at a point, an editor asked her to write up a book, do her own book to publish for the children's market. And she said, I don't think I can do that, but I just don't have it in me. He said, well, why don't you write from your experiences? So she wrote from her experience of being in a family with four sisters, as I mentioned earlier, or four sisters altogether, including her. And her four sisters were Anna, Louisa May, who, yes, she was the second one, Elizabeth, and Abigail May. And Abigail May, the youngest, becomes the model for Amy, the artist in the book. Elizabeth is Beth, the one who sadly, has to die. Louisa May, of course, is Tomboy Joe, the one who wants to be a writer and longs to run. And Anna is Meg, the older sister who goes and gets married. She comes out with a book called Little Women. So how did Alcott become such a major and seminal figure in the push for women's running? A movement that wouldn't really get going until a few decades after her passing. Well, with the publication of Little Women in 1868, there was an upsurge around the world of people who just loved this book. I mean, it became the it's certainly the most influential book for children, for girls in the mid to late 19th century, and it became the influence for a number of other works somewhat resemble like Anne of Green Gable and others where you have the kind of a feisty kind of girl as a heroine and everything, and Alcott, of course, was kind of a tomboy figure herself, and she made her the character of herself in the book Jo quite an inspiration to girls by the fact that she cut a rebellious figure, and I think she probably comes out as the most loved of the sisters, for many, I would say most likely for most of the readers, although there's others who prefer, I'm sure, Amy, the artist and all, or I don't know, maybe Anna or Beth. But in the book, she has a number of references for Jo about running. At one point, Jo says, Jo's ambition was to do something very splendid, and meanwhile found her greatest affliction in the fact that she couldn't read, run, and ride as much as she liked. And then later, after a bit of a race with her guy friend Laurie, she says, I wish I was a horse, then I could run for miles in the splendid air and not lose my breath. She galvanized generations of women to think about, hey, I can be out there running. I mean, Alcott isn't necessarily saying girls just have to grow up to be stuck behind the hoop dresses and all. The figures of Jo and everything inspire girls to get out there and run, and so that was a big influence there. And in the following decades, well, what happened? Now, because of Little Women, Louisa May Alcott became so popular that there were pilgrimages. Thousands would march up to Concord, Massachusetts, there to to visit her to pay their admiration, and she kept up her running. She'd get out there. I guess it was a big help for her writing too. You know, in her later years, I don't know, 30s, 40s, 50s, she'd be out there running. And in fact, it was said that she would, when the hordes of admirers would stop by, because she was extremely publicity shy, she would, you know, open up a window, tumble out, and get out for a run to get away from them. So, yeah, running was a big part of her life from girlhood to, you know, pretty close to the end. Although again, she was afflicted by various physical ailments from probably from the mercury poisoning and all she had had. So suddenly, with the publication of Little Women, girls were on the run all over the place, right? They were dashing around in long dresses in France and running competitions. They were dashing through the streets of London, Victorian hats. Not quite so much. It would take a while before things would get to the point where there were a lot of women out there running. Sure, there were plenty of outdoor activities for girls and young ladies. Croquet was popular, you know, out in the yard and all, at parties and so forth. Roller skating, either in parks or in armory-style tracks during the 1800s. Rinking, it was called, became a craze as the participants kind of went round and round a track, and that became very popular. Sure, there was skaters, you know, you get out there and skate, and on the parks of Central Park and all, and maybe even do a little ice hockey competition in places and everything. But yeah, I mean, there were always those kind of activities for at least the more leisured class, you know, and everything. But an associated activity of long distance walking competitions were also popular as pedestrian events, and you know, top pedestrians of the time, such as Amy Howard and Bertha von Berg and Isabel de la Chapelle, actually, you know, competed in the late 1800s and so forth in competition. So things were starting to get opened up there and all. And then sports really started taking over America. Sports, you know, up until the late 1800s weren't that big a phenomenon in America. You know, you had baseball teams here and there, but the you know, the pro types of things, even in the beginnings, didn't occur till, you know, well into the 1800s, you know, and everything. So it was no surprise that there really wasn't much for women, but they were starting to take up golf in big numbers, at least if they were, you know, again, you had more well-to-do for that. And here we have modeled by the famous Gibson girl of the 1890s. Basketball began to be played in the schools, and women also began to make headway in the tennis courts. And you know, suddenly there started to be competitions. And fame came to big talents like Annie Oakley, the sharpshooter with well, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, among others. She, yeah, if you could shoot like she did, you could make a good living and get a lot of fame from that. Women were even competing in boxing matches for prizes. Not sure that was too big a activity, but it could happen. And gradually, track and field competitions at women's colleges and track and, you know, field days and so forth at women's colleges like Vassar began, and women ran, first in the very long skirts, and then, gradually the running gear became a little bit more easy to run in as time went by. And in the following decades into the 1900s, women's track became more and more common, and by the 1920s, the amateur groups in France were organizing competitions for women separate from the Olympic Games, and they were so popular that the Olympic Games finally took them over. And it was kind of like the NCAA with all the women's basketball organizations or women's sports organizations in the early years after Title IX. They kind of took them over, and then didn't do well by them. And but in 1928, the women finally got a chance to run in some sprints and the 800 meters, so they had a start, but Baron Coubertin there and his gang quickly removed everything, so I think except for the 100 from them, and tried to stifle women in the Olympics, because they didn't really want them in there at all. But women would forge on over the next many years, overcome the hurdles, and even conquer field events like the shot put and all, and on their way to a very long delayed equality on the international scene. Well, I'll tell you, when early times when I saw the Olympics, it was frighteningly skimpy amount of running events for the women, even then in the 1960s and all. But Little Women could be cited as a big influence for the girls as they took up the pen to write or to put on spikes to run. The popular movies made from Little Women also helped spread the message. And the CT girl, remember this is where it was originally for Connecticut-XCite, who famously played Jo in one of the countless movie adaptations of Little Women in 1933, was cut from the same mold as Katharine Hepburn. She drank in the role and gave it back out in a slam-bang, tomboy gone wild manner that in her own mind won her the Academy Award, though officially it was for the less memorable Morning Glory of the same year. On her own girlhood, she stated, "I could outdive, outswim, outrun most of the boys around me." It would take around 40 years before any girl in the high school would be able to say that she could outrun most of the boys on the team. But the day would finally come, and indeed, in the latest adaptation of Little Women on the screen in 2019, Saoirse Ronan as Jo has an exuberant running scene after selling an initial piece of writing early on, and it was a heartwarming scene in the movie, and everything. So, women's running now rules, and we can thank, I think, to some extent, that wonderful author from the 1800s still. I don't think there's an American women's author that has been more read than her in the century and a half since Little Women was published in Louisa May Alcott. Thank you.